And you can do that by clicking on the three dots on the lower right-hand bottom corner of your screen and choosing Change Layout and the Spotlight setting. That will allow you to get the best view of the speaker. We will be recording this evening's presentation and making it available for later viewing on our website. We will have a question and answer period following the presentation. After Dr. King's presentation, we will engage with your questions. We might take some questions in between as well if it seems like they're timely to what the discussion is. You will have the opportunity to ask questions in chat, and then I will be posing those questions. So you won't need to unmute or be visible on the screen. If you'd like to ask a question more privately, you can email me if you'd prefer. The email address is Betsy, B-E-T-S-I-E, .norris, N-O-R-R-I-S, at adoptionnetwork.org, and I'll put that in chat as well. People did have the opportunity to submit questions ahead of time, and a few people have done that, and so Dr. King has been given those questions, and she'll be making sure to address those. We will have probably at least 15 or 20 minutes at the end of the presentation to address any questions. We are, as I said, excited to have this series. We're excited to have you with us this evening. The series is designed to provide opportunities for community exploration and comfort during this time. And all of the speakers in the series are generously volunteering their time. And as I said, we're posting the recordings. We've had Sharon Rosia, April Dinwiddie, Leslie Johnson, last week, Kate Vogel. And then tonight we have Dr. Jennifer King. Next week we have Moses Farrow about exploring racism and how to prevent it. May 18th, we have Leslie Pate McKinnon talking about the House of Mirrors, the importance of preparing for reunion. And then on May 25th, we have filmmaker David Bynum. We're going to be viewing and discussing his documentary, which is called A Place of Love. That particular offering is going to be a little different because the film is about an hour long, so we'll have a 90-minute time together, and we will not be recording that one. You can see details of those offerings and register for them if you're interested on our website. So now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Jennifer King, our presenter this evening. Her talk is entitled Beyond ACEs, Understanding Trauma, the Brain, and Building Resilience. Dr. King is an assistant professor at the Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences at Case Western Reserve University and the assistant director of the Center on Trauma and Adversity at CWRU. Dr. King is a clinical social worker and has practice experience working directly with traumatized individuals, families, and communities with the goal of helping the traumatized move from surviving to thriving. Jenny is a highly sought-after speaker and trainer and provides leadership over the trauma-informed curriculum at the Mandel School, providing training opportunities and advanced curriculum in the area of trauma-informed practice for master's level social work students as well as community practitioners to become better equipped to promote healing and resilience in individuals and in communities. So with that, I give you Dr. King. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Betsy. And hi, everybody. I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to be with you this evening, and also grateful that you have chosen to spend your time here with me this evening in this way. I saw a couple folks as we were about to get started having dinner. Please do that. Please eat, please drink, please get up and move. Take care of your own needs. I realize that it is hard to devote even just an hour to an opportunity like this. So congrats to you for taking the time out of your busy and ever-changing schedules to do this. And I'm grateful to be here with you. Given what we're dealing with collectively right now in terms of COVID-19 and all of the various stressors that we're navigating together, I thought it might be nice to start with an opportunity to just kind of move into this space together gently and with intention. So this is optional. I can't see you, so I'm not going to know if you're doing it anyway or not. But just in case you, like me and like many of us, are feeling the impacts in terms of the way that you are able to engage with other people, the way that you are able or not able to maintain focus and attention, if you're feeling scattered, I thought we could start, if you want to, just with an opportunity to turn attention inward. So if that is something that sounds like it might be helpful for you, I would invite you now to make sure you're seated in a comfortable position. Doesn't matter what that position is. If closing your eyes feels good, please do that, especially if you have been in front of a screen like you are right now multiple times today. If not, maybe just find a spot to kind of softly gaze at on the ground. So we're going to start here just by bringing a kind of gentle and curious attention to our breathing, not changing our breath in any way, just seeing what we notice about it as it comes in and as it leaves. Maybe you can register where you most strongly feel your inhale or your exhale. Maybe you feel it travel through your throat, through your chest, through your stomach. Maybe you notice a cooler temperature when you breathe in and a warmer one when you breathe out. Are you breathing in fully? And are you exhaling completely? Or are you hanging on somewhere in there? Just see what you find out as you take this curious look at your internal experience. So now I'd encourage you to consider your why. What led you to pursue this opportunity this evening? What's keeping you here with us, with me this evening? What are you hoping to get out of tonight, or how are you hoping to feel when it's complete? Just see if you can bring that forward. And lastly, I'd like you to consider, when we wrap up here, how you might do a little extra something to take care of yourself this evening. We're going to talk a little more about that tonight and why that matters, but see if you can envision it. Kind of picture yourself doing something that is nourishing or nurturing just for you. So if you've had your eyes closed, if you have kept your gaze soft, now would be a time to bring your attention back. You can move around a bit if that feels good to you, and we'll get started. So a couple kind of different topics that I'm going to cover this evening. We'll start with an overview of the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, what it taught us and what it didn't teach us. We will talk a bit about the impact of both trauma and resilience on the brain, the way that the brain develops and the way that the brain functions, and why that really is important in thinking about how we manage stress and trauma and how we support other people through their journeys utilizing this brain science. And lastly, there will be lots of time for questions. So like Betsy said, you are welcome to use the chat at any point to submit a question. If it's feeling really timely and urgent, like you want to stop me and ask it, definitely do that. Let Betsy know to interrupt me. That's not her being rude. I told her that she can do that. Or if you're comfortable, you can wait until the end. So I do have a couple of graphics and slides that I'm going to share with you, so you're not going to be staring at me this whole time, which makes me feel better and hopefully makes you feel better too. So I'm going to switch over to that now, and we will get started with a very brief overview of the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. Okay, so this sort of landmark study was a partnership between the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. And what they did was they surveyed 17,000 of their HMO members about 10 what they term to be adverse experiences that a person may have had prior to the age of 18. So the 10 exposures that they were asking about are there in those teal circles. So they categorize them as neglect experiences, both emotional and physical neglect, abuse experiences, emotional abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. And then this third category they deemed household challenges. So things like witnessing interpartner violence as a child, having a family member or a loved one or somebody in the home abusing substances or dealing with mental illness, parents separating or divorcing, or having a parent who is incarcerated. So they focused specifically on those 10 questions. And so participants were asked, yes or no, before the age of 18, did you have this thing happen to you in your life? What they ended up finding out was that the vast majority of their sample had at least one of those experiences happen to them in childhood. And for the percentage that had, that's at 67% there in the middle, the likelihood that they'd experienced more than one ended up being close to 90%. So not only did they find that trauma in childhood, adversity in childhood is incredibly common, they also were able to establish that trauma tends to beget trauma. So the prevalence, I think, was probably one of the biggest takeaways. Another was this link, the connection between trauma and adversity experienced in childhood and the risk for mental and physical health issues later in life. So we have a snapshot of a few of these here on this graphic. Up in the right-hand corner, 4 or more ACEs, it shows you the increased risk levels. The higher your ACE score, the more risk there is. There's this sort of dose-response relationship between experiences and potential risk. So not only did this establish that trauma is common, trauma does not occur in isolation, trauma can be linked with these bigger, more complicated outcomes later in life, but that the idea was that more ACEs in a person's life creates more trauma. So this, as you can imagine, was a pretty monumental thing. And to this day, despite it being about 20 years old now, is a study that people point to when their goal is to create momentum, interest, and education around the idea that we need to be thoughtful around our prevention efforts in terms of childhood trauma and childhood adversity. Now, this is most certainly not a complete picture. And while it is helpful in a lot of ways, I think it can create some undue anxiety and panic in other ways. And so if you are like me and like many other folks who are seeing this for the first time and are calculating your own ACE score and are realizing that maybe you're at that 4 or more threshold, it can feel very daunting. It can feel as if it's some sort of death sentence. And the reality is that it's just not true. So one of the missing pieces here was the fact that what's absent is information about folks who maybe did have an ACE score of 4 or higher and have done really well. So what is it about folks who have been able to thrive despite lots of adversity in childhood? So we have some information about that, and a lot of that actually relates to what we know about the brain and neurobiology, which we'll get to in a moment. The other pieces here, as a social worker, I have to mention, the exposures that they were looking at were limited to those that occur at an individual or family level. So there's not information here about social context, either in terms of risk factors or protective factors. So when we look at that sample, that 17,000 person sample, that was made up of Kaiser's HMO members. Those were people that have really good health insurance. They were largely middle class, white, college educated individuals. So when we look at ACE scores among other populations, among historically oppressed or overexploited groups, those numbers tend to be higher. We also know that there are lots of different sort of community experiences or community environments that lend themselves to higher ACE scores too. Lastly, this was an epidemiological study. So like I said, they were asking yes or no if these things happened. They were not asking how old were you when this thing happened? Did this thing happen one time or more than one time? Who was responsible for this? And all of those questions are really important because, as you can imagine, or as you might know from your own history, from your loved ones, from folks you work with, the timing and the proximity of those events really can create a different picture depending on when they happened, the closeness, if it was in the context of a caregiving relationship, those kinds of things. So it's a compelling picture, but it is incomplete. And the piece that I'm hoping to spend our time on is a bit of the piece around the neurobiology and what it is that we can do with this information to help ensure that we are helping folks to move forward and onto a path that is more healing. So we're going to do a kind of quick and dirty and very oversimplified introduction to the brain and the way that trauma may impact it. So what you can see in that graphic there is a color-coded depiction of a child's developing brain. So you can think about the brain in three parts, the bottommost being the primitive brain or the survival brain in the brainstem. So that's the part of your brain that connects your skull to your spinal cord. That part of the brain is responsible for some of the most basic but life-ensuring responses that we have. From there, on top of that sort of, is the limbic brain, the limbic system where emotion tends to live, where fear lives and anxiety and those kinds of things. And on top of that is the cortex, the cortical brain. This is a part of the brain that sets us apart from other mammals. This is where thinking, higher order thinking and planning and problem solving and all of those things live. So as you can see, the brain not only develops from the bottom up, it moves up in complexity the higher you go. So the most survival-focused basic functions are at the bottom, moving all the way up to the cortex, which is our most sort of sophisticated parts of our brain and of our functioning. So each part of the brain is associated with a certain set of functions, which is very important. So when we are in a calm or regulated state, ideally we have access to all three parts of the brain, and they're all communicating together. So I am going to see if I can stop sharing. And okay, you'll have to forgive me. I'm new to Google Meet. I'm a Zoom kind of gal these past 6 weeks, but I've got it. We're back. Okay. So I want to share with you now something that I talk to everybody about. I show everyone this. I teach it in my classes. I use it with my kiddos. I've used it with clients, and it's a really helpful kind of way of thinking about the pieces of neurobiology that are significant here in a really accessible, kind of catchy way. So you can use your hand to create a model of the brain that reflects what I just shared with you on that slide. So you're welcome to do this with me. I can't see you if you are, if you're not, but often in classrooms, when I raise my hand like this, people just do it with me. So you're welcome to join in if you want to. So if we were to create a model of the brain using our hand, the bottommost part of the brain stem, or the survival primitive brain, would be down here, right? So the wrist we can think of as the spinal cord, and that very bottom part of the palm would be the brain stem in the back here, right? So if we remember, this is where our survival functions live. So this is what helps us to pump blood and to breathe and to move and all of those things. As we move up our hands, and I'm going to cross my thumb over here, almost like a gate in a parking lot. This is where our limbic system lives. And our kind of parking gate here, that's our amygdala. And the amygdala has a really important job that I'm going to get to in just a second. Now, our most sophisticated part, that cortex, would be our fingers up top here. A note about the cortex. So the cortex is not fully formed until folks reach the age of about 25. Really significant, because if you remember, that's the part of the brain that some of those really sophisticated skills live. So the ability to reason, to use logic, to think ahead, to plan, to be future oriented, to multitask, all of that lives up here. In children, it's developing all the time, and largely their cortex develops by watching us use ours. So we're going to talk about regulation, relational regulation, co-regulation. That becomes really, really important. Our ability to tap into our cortex is what helps our kids develop their ability to do the same. So when all parts of our brain are working together, the cortex kind of folds over the front. And in the front here would be right in right behind my forehead here. So this is what we could consider to be a regulated brain. All parts are working together. They're doing their jobs. They're communicating. So that bottommost part is keeping us breathing, keeping our blood pumping. That amygdala is responsible for, as stimulation comes in, making decisions about where to kind of send that information, what parts of the brain to turn on and off, or to sort of recruit. Now, we take in stimulation all the time externally. Those decisions have to get made really, really quickly. So when everything's working together, the amygdala kind of keeps an eye out, says, you guys keep doing your thing. You lower part of the brain, you keep us breathing. I'll keep an eye on what's going on. Cortex, you figure out what we're going to have for dinner and how we're going to manage the issue with our partner that's been going on and bothering us, right? Now, when stimulation comes in and is deemed to be threatening, the amygdala cuts off access to the cortex, and all of our energy is devoted to the middle and bottommost parts of our brain. So when I teach this and when I talk about this, I talk about flipping the lid. So when stimuli comes in that is deemed to be physically, psychologically threatening, anxiety-inducing, stress-inducing, we kind of pop our top or flip our lid, and our cortex becomes unavailable to us. All of our energy is around our survival, right? So if you think about a physical threat, that might mean that our blood is pumping, our heart starts racing, our muscles get tense because we're getting ready to either run or to fight. And that reaction happens immediately, right? There's not time to think about, is this actually a lion that I need to run away from, or am I at a zoo and the lion is in its cage, right? There's no thinking about what is happening. Our bodies just respond. So when you think about two kind of related pieces, one, kiddos that you live with, love, know, have worked with, who already don't have a fully developed cortex and maybe have lived through some traumatic events that have caused this alarm to be ringing all the time, that can cause a flipped lid consistently. When the stress response is activated in a prolonged or ongoing way, it means that our kids are responding from here and not from up here. And similarly, as we consider this kind of ongoing unpredictability, the lack of control that we're currently dealing with in the face of COVID-19, many of us are walking around like this too. So I want you to consider, if you encounter a flipped lid, generally how you might respond to that and how you might try to get a person back together. Often what we do is we try to appeal to this. We try to use logic. We try to reason. We try to convince the person that the fear is not real, that they are safe, that this isn't as big of a problem as it feels like it is. We talk and talk and talk and talk to a part of the brain that's not going to be able to hear us, right? Now, think too about meeting a flipped lid with another flipped lid. So if you are in a state of dysregulation, if you're overwhelmed, if you're stressed out, if you're at your wit's end, if you're worried about what's going to be happening next, what tends to happen is we respond in that more physical way. Maybe we get loud, maybe our tone is more aggressive, which just signals to this person's amygdala that the fear was very legitimate. The threat is still there. And so I need to ramp this up even more. So as this person gets ramped up even more, so does this one. And we just kind of continue to trigger each other all over the place. So how we think about that is as an attempt to regulate another person from the top down by talking to them, reasoning with them, that kind of thing. That just doesn't work all that well. And if you think about yourself in a time where you're really feeling stressed out or anxious, maybe your heart is pounding, maybe you can kind of hear your heartbeat in your ears, you might try to reason with yourself and talk yourself down, and it doesn't work all that well. So the key instead is to think about starting from the bottom and working your way up. So instead of appealing to up here, helping, whether it's you or you're guiding somebody else through this, to get this bottommost part of the brain regulated, calm, soothed, shut off the stress alarm, that fight, flight, freeze response, and then you might be able to appeal to that cortical part of the brain. Let me pull up another graphic that will help to show you exactly what I'm talking about here. So if instead of moving from the top down, we want to quickly, efficiently, and effectively get a person's brain back to a regulated place, working together, calm and soothed, we have to start at the bottom. So we have to start with opportunities for regulation. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second here. Once that has happened, once a person is in even a relatively calm and sort of stable place, then it can be helpful to connect with the emotion that you were picking up. So whether it was anger, it was frustration, it was fear, it was worry, whatever that may be, hopefully you are in a calm enough place to be attuned to what that person is feeling and connect with that emotion. Once you have helped a person to become regulated, you have connected with them in a sensitive and attuned way, then it might be helpful to reason and to process with them about the thing that happened, about the worry that they're experiencing, whatever the case may be. So first regulate, then relate, then reason. Regulation can happen in a few different ways. On this slide, what I'm talking about is somatosensory self-regulation, which holy moly is a mouthful. But utilizing our senses to engage in activities and experiences that help to soothe our fight, flight, freeze response. So we think about these experiences, activities, techniques in terms of the 6 R's that are listed there on the left. So ideally, we are engaging in these activities in the context of a relationship with someone we care about. Now, that can't always happen, especially right now. That can't always happen. But ideally, that's what's going on. I would say the most important of those R's for our purposes tonight is that they are rhythmic, they are repetitive, and they are rewarding. So things that help us to keep a rhythm, to happen over and over again and feel good to us. It has to feel like fun. These are the types of things that can help to soothe us really quickly. So on the right hand in that blue box, you see a bunch of examples of potentially regulating activities. The more senses that can be engaged, the better, which is why cooking, for example, a lot of people find cooking to be a very relaxing experience. This is not by any means an exhaustive list, but I would encourage you to think about, for you, for your loved ones, what are the types of activities that they engage in and maybe kind of like lose time, right? I'm feeling so relaxed and so grounded and so myself that I'm kind of tuned everything else out and am engaging fully in what's happening in front of me. Many of these activities, first, a couple of things to think about. First, tend to be the ones that we view as rewards or as punishments for ourselves or for other people, right? So if I got everything done that I needed to do today, maybe I can make some time to get to a gym or go for a jog or do a yoga class or something like that. If a kiddo acted up in school, he's going to miss recess. Or he's not, he's dysregulated in art class, he's making a mess, he's not going to be able to draw, to color, or to paint. So unfortunately, we tend to view these not as necessary to our own abilities to function well, but as these kind of extra bonus experiences. And that's really a problematic thing. So the other thing to think about is dosing. So a therapeutic dose of one of these somatosensory experiences needs to only be 2 to 3 minutes long. Think about the barriers for you in engaging in some of these regulatory experiences, right? My first excuse always is that I don't have time. I don't have time to get to this class or to sit and just breathe or to go on a walk or any of those things. In reality, I don't need to devote hours of time to them. I can have sort of mini regulation breaks structured throughout my day. So if I know that I'm facing a stressful experience or something potentially challenging, I can offer myself 2 minutes before the thing happens and a few minutes after the thing happens to get back into a regulated place. Another form of regulation is relational regulation. And this is really, really, really important, especially right now. So we can think about relational health the same way that we do physical health, mental health, those types of things. We can think about it as a sort of spectrum. So a person can be relationally wealthy, meaning they are kind of surrounded by and insulated by people and places where they feel safe and connected and like they will not be harmed, where I have people that I know I can turn to when things are hard. On the other side of the spectrum would be a person who is relationally impoverished. So a person who lacks the presence of positive caregivers, of extended family, folks in the community, faith leaders, and also places and spaces where they feel the same. And especially relationally impoverished person may actually experience harm at the hands of the people who might be listed on this slide here. So this idea of relational health becomes really important when we jump back to thinking about the initial ACEs study and why there are some people who may have lots and lots of ACEs who do quite well. Relational health is a big piece of that puzzle. So this looks a little confusing. I will talk us through it. The Greyscale graph that you see in the background there was the initial sort of model for that connection between a person's ACE score and the number of health issues that they may have. So you can very clearly see the higher the ACE score, the higher the number of problems. What this research team that Dr. Bruce Perry led with other folks from the Child Trauma Academy, what they did was they were able to analyze where people fell on the spectrum from relationally wealthy to relationally impoverished. And in this graph, what they did was overlaid the relational health score on top of the gray score that's there. So there's a very light blue line that connects that ACE score of number 4. And if you remember that 4 or more ACEs was a pretty important threshold in terms of risk, right? Once the relational health scores were overlaid on top of it, a person with an ACE score of 4 or more started to look really different. So a person with an ACE score of 4, as we can see here, looks like a person with an ACE score of 0. So what they found was that regardless of the amount and frequency and intensity of the trauma a person experienced, the buffer that was created by the positive relationships around them was more significant. It was stronger, which is incredible when you think about the ways that we may be able to support and engage with one another. So our relational regulation is something that happens in community. It happens with other people. It happens as we are joining together with our colleagues, with our family, with our friends, and engaging in some of those other activities. That's really hard right now because we're not able to be physically with the people that we want to physically spend time with. So we have to get creative. We're able to use virtual meetings like this. We're able to spend time together, taking classes online, doing all sorts of things in that way. And those experiences are actually really, really important. So when we think about specifically kids who may have experienced a lot of trauma and are having difficulty with regulation and really need to have those regulatory experiences and have them in the context of supportive relationships, it's important for us to remember that that person who can be there to support a child as they engage in these regulatory experiences does not have to be a trained, licensed, or certified mental health anything. And in fact, when I think about some of the most sort of therapeutic people in the systems that I have worked with as a therapist, those people have been the janitor at the elementary school, the van driver to the partial HOS program that kids are being transported to and from, the food service folks at school, the lunch ladies, right? The calm and confident and caring and stable presence of a person as a child kind of does their thing, whether the lid is flipped or not, has the potential to do far more good than I would as a therapist 1 hour a week in my office. So I think there was a question before we got started about how a person who maybe isn't a social worker or maybe isn't trained in this stuff can be supportive to folks who have a lot of trauma in their histories. And here's how. All you have to do is be you and be caring and offer connection and keep yourself regulated. And that last piece can be really tricky because especially right now, none of us are immune to the stress of this kind of ever-changing climate. And so it can be hard as we, work maybe looks different. If there are little ones, kiddos at your house, maybe schooling looks different. We're dealing with a lot. But what's wild about this relational health thing is that we are able to regulate another person just by being calm and regulated ourselves, especially if we are a person in some sort of position of authority or power. So a parent, a supervisor, any sort of relationship like that. If you are able to meet a flipped lid with a not flipped lid, you will be able to help to soothe that person. The problem is the opposite of that is also true. So if you are not in a place of being regulated and you encounter a person who is struggling themselves, you can be influenced by them. So it can be hard for us to put ourselves at the top of our priority list in terms of engaging in regulation, engaging in self-care, all of those types of things. But what I would encourage you to think about is if what matters to you is caring for other people, which I would imagine if you're spending the evening with us here tonight, you might be one of those people who cares a lot about making sure other people are doing okay. It is entirely important that you put yourself at the top of your priority list. Because even if you are a person who is pretty good at staying like this and not like this, you can only take so much, right? We absorb a lot from the people around us, which is partly why this is amazing, right? Which is partly why that relational health piece is so important, because we are able to regulate and soothe one another just by being with the people that we love. But the sort of downside of that is you can only absorb so much. And so what are the ways that you can commit to figuring out how to metabolize everything that you're taking in all the time? What are the regulatory experiences, those somatosensory ones that feel good for you? Maybe think back to like your a long time ago, adolescence or even childhood, and the types of things that were enjoyable. Maybe that was art, maybe that was doing a puzzle, maybe that was singing or humming or swimming. You know, there are likely to be things that maybe you've even abandoned as you've gotten older, just because there's so many competing concerns and issues. Think about how you may reintroduce those. And remember, you don't have to devote a day. If you can give yourself a few minutes here, a few minutes there, especially if you know you're going to be encountering some extra stress or extra anxiety, then you are likely to be more like this than like this. So I would encourage you, like I asked at the start of our time together, to think about, is there anything even as we wrap up here that you can commit to doing for yourself, just for a few minutes and just for you, before you you head to bed or you end your day or your evening. So I moved quickly, hoping to have enough time for questions, for comments, for dialogue, for whatever. But I realized that that was a lot, and the slides and the graphics were a lot, so I can make those available, Betsy, to you and to the group so that folks can revisit them at another time. But I'm ready to open up for questions, for comments, for discussion, all that good stuff.
Well, thank you so much. We actually don't have any questions that have come in the chat. Does anybody want to pose any questions? Okay, we've got people thanking you. Oh, one question to speak specifically about adoption and ACEs, if you would.
So I think that in terms of ACEs and trauma, so interestingly, I would be curious if that initial ACE study, so they asked a lot of other questions that weren't related to childhood trauma. They were actually trying to figure out risk factors for obesity. That was the time when obesity was kind of the epidemic that folks were really concerned about. So they asked a whole bunch of lifestyle questions as part of that survey. And so I would be curious if adoption status was part of what they asked about. Trauma and ACEs tends to touch or can touch each piece of the adoption triad. So we think about trauma and ACEs in terms of a biological parent, in terms of adoptive parent, and in terms of kiddo, and the way that all may kind of interplay at different times. So If there's a more specific question in there, I'm happy to speak to that, but it most definitely plays a part. And I would imagine that they may have gathered data about status, but not trauma that may have led to that status.
Hi, can I elaborate on my question?
Yes, please. Yes.
Here, I'll turn my camera on too so you can see me. Hi,
Okay. Hi.
How are you? Thank you so much. This was fabulous. So my understanding is that adoption wasn't counted in that first grouping of 10.
It was not.
And so I'm just curious about that and the rationale for it. I mean, it helped to hear that it was an obesity study, and I'm not sure if you have the history of it. Or if you know, my understanding is that there's supplemental parts to ACEs now that include family separation status, like at the border, foster care.
Yes.
I'm not sure if adoption is explicitly mentioned, but I think that's a really important factor that, so much of our adopted people's trauma has been unrealized and invalidated because it hasn't been part of, this body of work specifically way back in the 80s, 90s when they started. So it's great that you're here now.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I think that, this is being recorded, but I've gone on record as saying, I am not a huge fan of the ACEs study in terms of the survey itself. And so unfortunately, I think because it paints such a compelling picture, folks even now are still over relying on it. So we're seeing it popping up clinically, which is a disaster. Because as you're noting, there are many, many, many experiences that we might consider to be traumatic that are not captured there at all. And interestingly, some of what I know about the response of the researchers to those numbers, those initial prevalence rates, they ran them over and over again because they couldn't believe that this is what they were finding out. So they didn't set out to find this. They weren't comfortable when they did find it. So I don't think their first thought was, oh, we should ask more questions about trauma and about adversity in childhood. There are great screening tools now and measures now that are much more inclusive of a variety of different experiences and different types of separation, like you mentioned, traumatic loss and grief experiences and all those types of things. So depending on the purpose, there are much stronger studies and tools out there that are available to us now.
Thank you.
Sure.
I think one of the interesting things about ACEs is because it's become popular, that it's put words or more popular concepts in our community to some things that people have been talking about for a long time, but weren't necessarily, out there in, daily use the way they might be now with the ACEs study.
Yes. And shared language is important. And so if we're all able to talk about things in the same way, that's helpful, but it most definitely has limitations. And I think as it gains in popularity, we're seeing it be used in ways that was never meant to be used.
Good point. Any other questions before we wrap up? Yeah, let me just double check my email and make sure I'm not missing anything.
I see there's a question in about addiction, people with addiction and flipping lids. That could have been a whole talk of its own. So interestingly, I think there's a lot of research out there about trauma and substance use. And I am not a substance use clinician or expert by any means, but I think that when we think about that alarm bell going off all the time, that example that I gave, which actually many of us might be experiencing right now during this crisis, where we're a kind of teetering or kind of constantly lid flipped. we think about addiction, substance use, substance abuse as attempts, regulatory attempts. And for some folks, at a biological level, which I can't speak to in a way that I would want to, it's somewhat effective in calming some of those physiological responses to substance use. And so it's a really tricky thing if what is going to help your alarm to stop, which doesn't necessarily mean that you get all your parts of your brain back online, but physiologically you may experience that relief in a short term. It's kind of an attempt at managing the activated stress response for a lot of folks. Does that make sense? Is that kind of what you were asking? Okay.
So we had a question about positive relationships and how long would the healing and the preventative impact?
That's a great question. So the more that we can, there's not a hard and fast rule, first of all. I wish there were, right? Like just X amount of hours with, over this amount of time would be much easier. It's probably intuitive, but the more that you can insulate a person with those positive relational experiences, the more healing it is. It takes a lot of time, and it's also related to the degree of difficulty. So if a person has had, and the timing matters too. So we know that trauma that occurs like 0 to 3, 0 to 5, when the brain is more rapidly developing, is more impactful in terms of modifying the structure and function of the brain than something that may occur at a less sensitive time. So it's variable, but we try to think about, if there are 24 hours in a day, how many of those hours can we make sure an individual is spending in the company of someone who is safe, who is caring, who is compassionate, and can help them or just be with them while they engage in some of those regulatory experiences. So that to me is what's truly therapeutic, and why I say that an hour in a therapist's office, that's not going to be what can facilitate healing fastest. So I would say, whatever you can do to mobilize the people around an individual to create that sort of like web, that therapeutic web or therapeutic net for them, the better. So it takes pressure off of caregivers too. It doesn't have to just be you. It can be teachers, it can be janitor, it can be coaches. Coaches have a great potential in terms of being part of a healing plan for someone. So get as many people involved as often as possible.
Thanks. We had one more question now about the research of the effect of preemie babies who spend 2 or more months in NICU and then go on or go that time without the parental bonding. This particular child went from NICU to foster care.
So that's tricky, and I think where we tend to see, so we say 0 to 5 is the most vulnerable time, but actually prenatally until I think they're saying now 6 or 9 months is an incredibly sensitive time, and a lot, I would imagine, for a child who had that experience, and what the research says about kids in the NICU is that some of the absence of touch can create difficulty for kiddos like that. So when you think about what might be, again, therapeutic for a child that had that experience, it may be touch-based stuff. It may be massage or self-massage or Reiki, those types of things to kind of give stimulation to the part of the brain that didn't get it when they were in the NICU.
You. Could you talk a little bit about PTSD?
Sure. Yeah, so post-traumatic stress disorder is our kind of one of the only trauma-focused diagnoses that we as folks who diagnose have access to. It's marked by 4 different kind of symptom clusters. So first, there's some sort of trauma has occurred, either directly or maybe I was a witness to it. It was something that caused maybe fear, terror, helplessness, those types of things. I thought I was in grave danger. So that's one. And then there are these sort of 4 symptom clusters that I'm going to try really hard to just say off the top of my head right now. Maybe I'll get 3 of the 4. That'll be good. One being avoidance. So avoiding reminders, cues that bring up the experience that may have happened. Negative symptoms, shifts in mood and cognition. Oh no, I'm going to forget the other 2. Some degree of hyperarousal or hypervigilance, and some sort of internalizing symptoms, things that may look like nightmares, things that may look like flashbacks of pieces, parts of what has happened. As a person who does diagnose, you feel really limited by it, because what we know is that for folks who have experienced more than one traumatic event, or one that maybe wasn't isolated, or one that was ongoing or chronic or repetitive, the symptoms may encompass those 4 areas, but they usually go far beyond. So I'm thinking of a lot of the kids and the families that I have worked with. Relationships are really hard. So attachment may be a problem. Sometimes there are learning disabilities and executive functioning problems and issues with cognition and tummy aches and headaches and digestive stuff. There's a lot that that goes on, and that's true for adults too. So I'm speaking of children. So what we tend to think, or I tend to think, is that PTSD may be an appropriate catch for this part of what this individual is dealing with, but often there are these other symptoms that aren't sort of explained away by that diagnosis. But we, as folks who abide by the DSM, that's one of the only trauma-related diagnoses that we have access to. So not everyone who experiences trauma develops PTSD. Not everyone who experiences trauma develops any sort of symptom that requires intervention or therapy. And I realize I may not have said that earlier. So that ACEs piece, those connections, that's an important part too, is that the majority of folks who experience trauma go on to do just fine without any sort of medical or mental health intervention.
Thank you. We have one question. This will be the last one, and it's kind of long, so you might want to see it in chat. But when we're with someone who flips their lid, how do we meet them where they are? Is it age dependent? She has heard that an activity that tries to get the kids into their senses with 5 things they can see, 4 things they can hear, etc., or even breathing with them, trying to get them, to give them space to just feel it. Is that too much trial and error, or what works?
Great question. I think to some degree, I wouldn't say age dependent. I would say developmentally dependent. But often it can be as simple as cueing a person, not even just a child, but a sort of flipped, dysregulated person to move with you, to go into a different room, to take a walk, to physically move around. So some of what we can make developmentally appropriate actually is helpful for all of us. It's just that the language might be different. I think even the breathing with is enough. So what we tend to do though, because we're uncomfortable or we're dysregulated, is we start talking during that attempt at regulation. I, as a mother, talk way too much. I know that. That's a response, my own sort of stress response. So if we can sit and breathe with and contain, sometimes that is more powerful than even the grounding technique that you mentioned, that 5 things, 4 things, 3 things. That's effective regardless of age, but for some kids, for some individuals, the silence may be better. So there is definitely a bit of trial and error to it.
Good, thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. This was so informative. And again, everyone, this will be posted on our website. Give us a few days to get it up there. We will include the slides. Thank you again to Jenny for this wonderful presentation. So informative. As many of you know, Adoption Network Cleveland is a nonprofit organization. We serve individuals and families impacted by adoption, kinship, and foster care. We're extremely excited to be partnering with experts in our national community to offer this Monday evening speaker series. We are a membership-based organization, and we hope that you'll consider joining us as a member. To find out more about our organization and to support our work, you can visit our website, which is adoptionnetwork.org. And you can join us next week for Moses Farrow presenting Explaining Racism and How to Prevent It. So thank you again, Dr. King.
Thank you.
All right. Good night.